The next megatrend is a bit less visible on a day-to-day basis, but it powerfully shapes the environment in which organizations operate. A contraction of capital markets and a new era of economic restraint. For much of the past decade, especially in the 2010s, the world enjoyed very low interest rates, abundant capital, and booming asset values. It was relatively easy for companies to raise money, for investors to pour cash into new ventures, and for consumers to borrow for homes and education. This era fostered a sense of perpetual growth. Churches, too, often benefited indirectly as endowments grew and donations remained stable. However, recent years have signaled a turning point. Factors such as rising inflation, triggered by pandemic disruptions and geopolitical shocks, have led central banks to hike interest rates dramatically. The financial climate is shifting from one of cheap money to one of caution and higher costs. What does this mean in practical terms? Borrowing is more expensive. Whether it's a family taking out a mortgage or a church refinancing its building loan. Investors have become more selective. The flood of venture capital into every new idea has slowed to a trickle, meaning fewer startups and potentially less innovation in certain sectors. We are likely entering a phase of slower growth across many economies. Some speak of secular stagnation, the idea that structural factors, like aging populations and saturated markets, will keep growth subdued even after current cyclical issues pass. In addition, global debt levels are at or near record highs, both public and private. Governments face heavy burdens servicing debt if interest rates remain high, which could crowd out spending on social services or lead to austerity measures. For businesses, tighter capital means focusing on efficiency and perhaps consolidation, fewer expansion projects, more cost-cutting. For individuals, it can translate to less financial security. Think of the aspiring homeowner seeing their dream delayed because mortgage rates doubled, or a college graduate with loans facing higher repayment costs and fewer lucrative job opportunities in a tepid economy. In the context of ministry, a capital-constrained environment poses its own challenges. Many churches and nonprofits rely on charitable giving, which is directly influenced by economic well-being. When people feel financially squeezed by inflation, job instability, or market downturns, donations to churches or charities often suffer. We've also seen that churches themselves are not immune to needing capital, whether it's funding a new building, expanding a community program, or simply keeping up with maintenance. They sometimes take on debt or run capital campaigns. A climate of financial caution can make these efforts more difficult. Major donors might tighten their belts, and financing costs are higher. Moreover, if government budgets contract, the social safety nets might fray, potentially leaving more people in need. Needs that often spill onto the doorstep of local faith communities that run food pantries, shelters, or counseling ministries. In other words, churches could face increased demand for help at the very moment resources are harder to come by. This is a classic squeeze that tests the resilience and creativity of ministry leadership. Globally, a contraction in capital markets often hits emerging economies hardest. We should be aware that when the U.S. and other major economies become less eager to invest abroad and instead pull money back home, developing countries can experience severe consequences, currency devaluations, spikes in inflation, or even debt crises. There have been recent examples. Countries that borrowed heavily during good times, finding themselves on the brink of default when global conditions changed. While these events happen far from our local church contexts, they affect our mission partners overseas and can drive new waves of economic migration, people leaving their home countries because opportunities dry up. Thus, a pastor or mission leader may see more immigrants arriving in the congregation's city, or hear distress from overseas ministry partners, as ripple effects of global financial tightening. In some, the era ahead might require ministry leaders to practice prudent financial stewardship, contingency planning, and perhaps to rediscover the power of sharing resources and bearing one another's burdens economically in the community. Deglobalization, retreating from a connected world. Another major trend, closely interwoven with economics and politics, is the partial unwinding of globalization. For the past few decades, the assumption was that the world would keep becoming more interconnected. Supply chains spanning continents, trade barriers coming down, travel and migration increasing, and a general trajectory toward one global marketplace. That assumption has been shaken in recent years. We are now seeing a clear movement toward deglobalization, or at least a significant reshaping of globalization. This is driven by several factors. Geopolitical tensions, for example, the rivalry between the United States and China, which has led to trade wars and mutual tariffs. National security concerns, countries worrying about relying on foreign powers for critical goods like semiconductors, medical supplies, or energy. And the painful lessons of the pandemic, which revealed how extended supply chains can be fragile. Recall the shortages of everything from masks to microchips when factories overseas went offline. The result has been a surge in economic nationalism. Many nations are seeking to reshore or friend-shore manufacturing, bringing production back home or to allied countries, even if it's less economically efficient than sourcing globally. Trade agreements are being renegotiated with more skepticism toward unfettered free trade. In raw numbers, one could point to the sharp increase in tariffs and trade restrictions around the world in just the past few years, reversing a decades-long trend of liberalization. The effects of deglobalization are multifaceted. Consumers might notice higher prices or fewer choices as imported goods become costlier or scarcer. Industries are undergoing disruptive reconfiguration. For instance, electronics manufacturers might move plants out of China to Vietnam or Mexico, chasing a balance of lower risk and lower cost. While some regions, like parts of Southeast Asia, might gain investment as new manufacturing hubs, other countries lose out as global supply lines shift. Overall, the efficiency that came from each country focusing on what it does best, classic comparative advantage, diminishes, potentially slowing global growth and raising costs. There's also a political dimension. Deglobalization often accompanies a rise in populist or nationalist sentiment as people react against perceived losses from globalization, like job outsourcing or cultural change. This can lead to more polarized domestic politics and strained international relations, a world of blocs rather than one big village. For the Church and its mission, deglobalization presents some interesting dynamics. One positive aspect is the emphasis on localism, a concept that resonates with many ministries. If businesses and governments are investing more in local communities and domestic production, that could revitalize certain local economies that had been hollowed out by offshoring. We might see, for example, manufacturing jobs returning to parts of the American Midwest or South. Communities that lost factories decades ago might get a second chance with new plants being built. A church in such a community could find new opportunities to minister to an industrial workforce and shape community renewal. Additionally, shorter supply chains and regional self-sufficiency could align with stewardship values, such as caring for creation by reducing the carbon footprint of transporting goods globally. Though I should note, deglobalization itself isn't necessarily driven by environmental concerns, but it could incidentally encourage more sustainable local practices. However, there are also challenges and risks. If global cooperation wanes, tackling global problems like climate change or refugee crises becomes even harder. These are issues where the Church often advocates for justice and compassion across borders. We may also find international mission work subject to new restrictions. A more polarized world may limit the ability of foreign NGOs, including faith-based ones, to operate in certain countries. Already we've seen countries like China or India put tighter controls on foreign funding of nonprofits, which affects Christian organizations, among others. And if travel or exchange programs become more difficult due to visa restrictions or political hostility, the global church family could feel more fragmented. Furthermore, emerging market economies that previously benefited from integration into the global system, lifting millions out of poverty through export-led growth, could stall. That could increase global inequalities and, again, spark migration from poorer regions to richer ones as people seek what they can't find at home. Local congregations in the U.S. might thus encounter more diverse immigrant populations, a beautiful opportunity for multi-ethnic ministry, but only if we're prepared to bridge cultural gaps. In summary, deglobalization means we're likely entering a world that is a bit less fluid and open than before. It's a reminder that the context of ministry can shift with geopolitical winds. Church leaders will need a finger on the pulse of global events, not out of abstract interest, but because those events will echo in our local realities, from the cost of goods at the church food pantry, to the new family from overseas sitting in the back pew, to the missions budget that now needs to account for higher travel costs and new regulations. Consolidation of industry. The big get bigger. The final megatrend I'll highlight in this economic overview is the consolidation of industry, essentially, the increasing concentration of market power in the hands of fewer, larger companies. Over the past 2 decades, many industries have seen a wave of mergers and acquisitions that have reduced competition. In the United States, this is striking. Sectors from airlines to banking to media to agriculture have all come to be dominated by a few giant players. To put it concretely, if you look at the data, you'll find that in the majority of economic sectors, a small number of firms account for an ever-growing share of the market. There are roughly 2,000 fewer publicly traded companies in the U.S. today than there were at the turn of the millennium, because so many have merged or been acquired. Picture the local landscape. Instead of many independent stores and businesses, we now often have one Amazon, one Walmart, one Google or Facebook equivalent in each domain, casting a long shadow over the rest. This consolidation can have mixed consequences. Proponents argue that superstar firms are highly efficient. They can leverage economies of scale to drive down costs and spur innovation. Think of how a tech giant can invest billions in R&D, or how a national retail chain can offer low prices by buying in bulk. Indeed, some consolidated industries have seen lower consumer prices or improved services through technology. However, there are notable downsides. Monopoly or oligopoly power can stifle innovation in the long run by reducing competitive pressure. It can also squeeze suppliers. A large buyer can demand cut-rate prices from farmers or manufacturers, for instance, affecting their livelihoods, and it can limit choices for consumers. Importantly for the workforce, consolidation often means fewer employers in a town or sector, which can depress wages and limit job options. If there's only one big factory or one dominant hospital system in your region, your bargaining power as an employee is lower. Also, large corporations, driven by shareholder profits, may make decisions that upend local communities, such as closing a plant and moving production elsewhere, with little recourse for the community affected. So how does this factor into ministry? Consider the social and personal dimensions. Local economies and small businesses have historically been part of the backbone of community life, including church life. The owner of the local grocery or the family that ran the bank were not only economic actors, but community leaders and supporters of local institutions like churches. As industry consolidates, many small and mid-sized businesses struggle to survive. We've all seen main streets with shuttered shops due to a big box retailer opening nearby, or family farms bought out by large agribusiness firms. The erosion of small businesses can lead to a loss of community cohesion and identity. People end up working for large corporations where decisions are made in a distant headquarters. Churches might find it harder to engage corporate leadership on local issues when that leadership isn't physically present in the community. Furthermore, the wealth generated in a consolidated industry often flows to a relatively small group of owners or investors, often out-of-state or global investors, rather than being widely distributed. This can exacerbate inequality. You might have a situation where a few individuals in a community are doing extremely well, while many others struggle in lower-wage jobs that these dominant companies provide. However, this new reality can also push the church to innovate in its role. If fewer big players control critical services, perhaps churches and faith coalitions can serve as independent voices advocating for ethical practices, fairness, and community investment from those companies. In some towns where traditional jobs have vanished due to consolidation, churches have become key community centers that retrain workers or incubate small local enterprises. For example, hosting a farmers market to support remaining small producers, or providing space for local artisans. Additionally, the church can minister to those caught in the churn of corporate change, families forced to relocate because a mega company transferred the breadwinner, or employees coping with the cultural shifts of working in a giant impersonal organization. The psychological impact of being, say, a gig worker for a tech platform versus a long-term employee of a hometown business is different, and pastoral care may need to respond to things like increased anxiety, lack of job security, or the need for finding one's identity beyond corporate status. It's also worth noting that in many emerging markets, high industry concentration is not a new phenomenon. Often a handful of conglomerates or state-owned enterprises dominate multiple sectors. What might be shifting is that global giants are extending their reach into those markets as well, sometimes outcompeting local firms. The result can be seen in something as simple as a village in a developing country, where suddenly most people's cell phones come from one of two global companies, and their social media is all on one global platform. The homogenization of commerce and culture through consolidation is a worldwide trend. Ministries across the globe, then, share common ground in grappling with how to encourage diverse, sustainable, local economies and the well-being of those left on the margins of big economy.